Welcome to MPA Connections with me, your host, Lashanti the Siren. This podcast will be diving into the MPA Connect network. This network exists to connect MPA managers across the Caribbean. In this special series, each episode will feature interviews with managers from across the network to show how this initiative is meeting the real needs of MPA managers by tapping into the wealth of real world experiences and inspiring new approaches and ideas for their marine protected areas. On today's episode, we have our guest, Joe Villafranco from the Tide Belize organization. Welcome, Joe. Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. It's truly an honor. As you said, my name is Joe Villafranco. I'm the development director for the Toledo Institute for Development and Environment, which is TIDE, and we're located in the southern part of Belize, Central America. So we manage, or rather, I should say, co-manage the Port Honduras Marine Reserve along with the government of Belize.
Awesome. So, can you give us a brief introduction about who you are as far as like your educational background and all the experiences and things that you went through to get into conservation and even get to this position here at the Institute?
Okay, well, I grew up in the countryside, and my family really we were into farming, and really it was not very sustainable in the sense that it used to be slash and burn because that's what most people were doing. So you basically cut down the forest and then you burn it, and then you get to plant, and the plants really grow well, and that's just because of the nutrients and that whole biochar that you get that really allow the plants to grow well. But the downside to that, of course, is that the area is now prone to erosion from the rains and so on and so forth. And in the southern part of Belize, we get the highest rainfall in the entire country, which is like 160 inches of rain per year,
Wow.
and it rains like 6 months of the year. So I mean, it's good and bad,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of erosion if you aren't careful in how you approach farming. And so I went to school, college, university, and so on, and I studied biology. Um, and that's when I realized that these types of farming practices can have negative effects on the environment, not just in the immediate area, but also when you travel down the river and eventually out to the coral reefs. We were also during school. I was also exposed to going out in the field, going out to sea, seeing corals, snorkeling, and realize there's a whole another world, and it's so beautiful that there's the first thing that comes to mind is that you want to do something to ensure that you can protect
Yeah.
this environment. Um, and so I actually, even like just before I left school or I graduated, Tide had a vacancy for a marine biologist, and so I applied, even though I was fresh, didn't have a lot of experience. Uh, but the advantage I think I had is that I was from the Toledo district,
Yeah.
and so it's like going back home for me. And so I was fortunate enough to be given that opportunity, and that's where it all started, I guess. As the marine biologist, I started doing like water quality out in the seas, looking at coral, looking at fish, learning to snorkel, learning to dive, working with mangroves, um, and then eventually uh, there were other opportunities for me to move in other directions of the organization that had to do with more of management. And though I love being out, I realized that there was this gap in the organization, and seeing, I also had a vision for what I wanted the organization to be. And I thought, well, we have to fill this gap of managing these projects and managing the whole programs at Thailand. And so I started working on managing the program and getting into planning and budgeting and all of that, and supervising people out in the field. And it was okay enough. But I think that I probably had an eye for it, and so my boss quickly realized that I had potential to get more into this level. And
Right.
since there was also a need, I think I just kind of fell into that.
Yeah, budgeting is always the word that I think a lot of project managers and just a lot of like line staff in organizations are like, oh my gosh, anything but the budget. I know I'm very much as a marine biologist, I'm like, if I have to do a budget, I'm like, can you guys just give me the money? I don't know how to do the budget stuff. So to
That's
hear,
true.
that in the network you're known as like this marine biologist turned budget guru, so how did you do that? Give me
I
some budget
wouldn't.
tips. Like, how did you show from marine biologist this heavy science? And I think even throughout studies and just throughout work as a marine biologist, budgeting just, I don't know, but clearly for you, so tell me, how did you become the budget guru, the MPA budget guru?
Well, I don't know if I'll give myself that name, but okay. Um, it stems back to the need and the issues that I had while trying to manage these projects and programs, and realizing that there were a lot of questions that I didn't know the answer to, like how much do we need to spend in these different areas. If a donor comes and say, well, where's your financial gap? It was difficult for us to get to that point. And every time we needed to answer the question, we had to go digging through all of these different projects, trying our best to bring them together. And there's, no certainty as to whether or not you actually have the real figures.
Right.
And then there's also the need for the people working with finances, like the accountants and so on, and the finance people to know where should we spend, how much money do we have, working with balances and making sure that we're not spending outside of what we're supposed to be spending.
Right.
There were a lot of questions, even at the board level or the governance level. They wanted to know how much money do you have for these bigger things, like how much are you spending on travel, how much are you spending on education and outreach. And so all of these questions put together, I decided that I have to come up with a better way of responding to them. And then it kind of led me back to the whole planning aspect of it. And that's where you have to really get it started. If you don't have it in the planning, then it's going to be very, very difficult for you to get it in the end.
Yeah.
And so I developed this huge Excel sheet, and eventually turned into a tool. But there was a lot of trial and error and stuff like that, to find a point where it worked for everybody.
Right.
And though I was just using it for my own purposes, really. And I'm trying to remember exactly how the MPA got a hold of it, or how it all came out. But I don't know. Emma invited me to a presentation. It was just a presentation at the time. And I briefly talked about it and showed people what we do or how we approach budgeting and management of all of these projects. And then suddenly there was a lot of interest from everybody, because they realized that, hey, we could do something like this. We were not doing it like that. We're doing it our own old-fashioned way, and it clearly wasn't working. And I guess that's kind of where it started. Of course, I did not study anything with finances, so it's just like stuff I learned throughout my career.
Yeah, but that can be valuable. And I think another question I would want to ask is, do you see any benefits of not coming from a financial background helping you do what you do now?
Yes. Actually, I think that my accountant might not agree with me, but I'll say it anyway. I think it's actually more advantageous
Okay.
to approach it like, because you're able to fully understand why you need to approach budgeting from that perspective. It's more of an activity-based type budgeting, um, combined with a little bit of the traditional way in which they approach budgeting, which is more at the top, the higher level.
Right.
Um, but I think that because I'm able to understand projects and how these types of projects work from the ground up, I'm better able to develop a budget that's more suited to this type of. And you don't learn it in school,
Yeah.
They teach you science or business.
Right.
Never a combination of both.
Yeah. And I think it is always important to, in the conservation field, to pull in all of these different skills and things to creating plans and creating budgets, because you may see things, like you said, like that a person who had a financial only background would never have thought of or never consider when making budgets for things like this. So yeah, I can definitely see what you mean about it being more advantageous. And I know you had said you had some time in the field, and I'm going to put up the first picture. Yeah, so can you tell us a bit about what's happening in this picture?
Well, this is just us going out to check on some of our projects that we have in the field, and in the background there we have my director, Salim Mahong, and then two of our rangers that were taking us out into the field to just see what's going on. We get a taste of getting into the water or walking on the land and stuff like that. It's always good to. It's honestly, it's difficult to get out into the field. I just there's so much to do with budgeting and planning and reporting. Now I have development, which I'm now doing, writing grants and stuff like that. So getting out into the field is difficult. And so we just quickly use this opportunity. This is a snapshot of the Port Honduras Marine Reserve on top of our ranger station. So there's a lookout tower that you climb up, and you get like a 360-degree view from there. So it gives you an appreciation of.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No worries. I was just going to say, back to what you said about in the other photo. So how often do you get to go out and appreciate, this view? Like, look at this. Or are you oftentimes stuck at the computer working on budgets? And I think that is another one of the things where it's like, oh, budgets, I'm going to be at the desk for hours. Like, how often do you get out in the field anymore?
All I can say is not enough.
Not enough.
It's because, as you said, it takes a lot of time and patience, and you have to be meticulous, because with numbers, you know how that goes. You can't be. You have to always double check and stuff like that. So even if it's a short budget you might be working on, you still have to spend a lot of time.
Yeah.
But we try to go out as much as possible, a minimum, every month or every 2 months, something like that.
Yeah. And I think that's important to remind you what you're doing it for, right?
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Okay. And sorry, let me put you back down. All right, and this is it the same area?
Yeah. So this is this picture. This is actually in front of Punta Gorda town, where the office is. Tide's office.
Well, that's a nice.
It's not really in this picture right now, but you get this a little bit further to the north. But this is just outside of the Port Honduras Marine Reserve, and this is a local fisher that fish subsistence fishermen.
Okay.
And how most people used to fish this way in the past. Now that's changing to motorized engines and so on. So people are becoming more efficient at fishing, which has its pros and cons.
I wondered if you would say that, because I definitely always think like humans are getting more efficient at doing things like fishing and hunting, and as a conservationist, it's like that's great for humans.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The ones who are already at the top of the food chain, and I think in becoming more advanced and more efficient, I think it sometimes disconnects us from nature, and so we often forget that we're a part of this circle and this ecosystem, and I think that's why, as far as conservationists goes, it's so hard to reconnect people because they just can't see the connection. Whereas before, when you're actively engaging with the environment, like you're not just powering on a motorboat, you're appreciating the fact that as you paddle along, you see things and you're taking in nature, as opposed to now you have an engine on your boat and you just zip past everything and it's just tunnel vision. So yeah. I'm glad you said pros and cons. I was like, oh man, we're so intelligent, but it can really be to our detriment sometimes. So conservationists will save the world.
Well, I mean that's why we try to manage it, because you have to have a balance. Though boats have made us more efficient, if we don't have some sort of a check, those checks and balances in place, we could end up in that situation as well. Not just from Belize's standpoint, but we are also very, very close to our neighbors in Guatemala. Has this huge population, huge demand for anything, not just fish. And so they often come over into Belize's waters to fish, and that's just, I think they're just driven by the fact that there's a need, there's a huge need. And so, but we have been working with other NGOs in Guatemala and Honduras, because that's where most of the fishers come from that go into our waters. On programs like conservation programs, education programs, so that they are aware of the laws in Belize, where the marine protected area is, and so on and so forth. But it's very, very difficult. And at home we have managed access, which is an incentive-based approach to fisheries management that would have all of these measures, these checks and balances in place to ensure that we don't get into an overfishing situation. But of course, none of this is foolproof. I mean, we have to be adaptive for the most part.
It takes time. We're still learning a lot of things and ways to deal with all of these changes that are happening for us as humans living in the environment, or with the environment rather. But I know I've heard that you recently took a trip to the Eastern Caribbean. Can you tell us what the trip was about? How did it go? What did you do there? I'm very interested.
Yeah, I wouldn't say recently, because when you talk about the Caribbean, you have to be like every year. And my trip was 2 years ago, just before COVID, actually.
Pre-COVID, when life was
pre-COVID. Yeah. And there was all of these plans to go back like every year, and never happened. But it was very, very interesting. I've been there, I think maybe like the last one was the third trip to the Eastern Caribbean areas. On the last trip, Emma and I did the training in budgeting and so on in several countries for several MPAs. I flew into Antigua, Barbuda, came down to St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and some smaller islands, Carriacou and Yunnan Island, and then went on to Grenada. So it was a nice tour. Yeah.
Exactly. You did a wonderful tour. So, nice tour. In visiting all those places, what would you say is the number one or two, or however many top things that people in the Eastern Caribbean have issues with when it comes to this budgeting aspect? What was the most common, I guess, question or just that challenge that people had?
I think it varies a bit, because some MPAs rely on government government assistance and subsidies from the government. And they approach budgeting differently, because they have to do basically what the government wants them to do, or how the government wants them to present the budget, which in many cases doesn't give them a true picture of what it costs to manage the MPAs. They couldn't say how much they spend on a number of programs, because they don't do the budget like that. They would say, I'm going to spend X amount of money per quarter. And then they submit that to the government. So there's no differentiation between what you're going to use those monies for.
Wow.
And then And then you have other people who rely on entrance fees from their parks, and then they get to use that. And again, most of the budgeting have been happening at macro level, and so there were not much details as we go through. For example, we would, for one activity, we would have budget for each of the sub activities in that activity, and that's how we approach it for every single activity. Um, as well as across the top, the higher level budgeting. So we're able to answer detailed questions as well as present upper level information for anybody who wants it, whether it's the government or the accountant or board of directors. So it's like one document taking into consideration um, your budgetary needs, but also looking at what your objectives are, what are your expected outcomes, what are your inputs, what are your indicators, the targets, where you want to go, putting all of that information into that big document. So you can use it as to track your budget expenses, but also use it to track your implementation of activities and where you are in terms of trying to accomplish your targets.
Right. And so, were there any commonalities in regards to budgets and or budget challenges when it comes to, I guess, like writing proposals for funding from either like a grant giving organization or even just, I guess, private donors who are interested in just getting this kind of proposal? Are there any challenges or common challenges that you see with those types of budgets?
I haven't seen any challenges related to the budgeting aspect of it. Most donors want high level budgeting. The only thing I see is that they want their budgets in these broad budget categories, they would often call them, like travel, and then you basically have to take all of your travel costs and put them under that travel category.
Yeah.
But then it doesn't tell you how you're going to spend on each of your individual categories, like how much of that travel money is going toward education, or how much is going toward research and monitoring, how much is going towards enforcement. The donor budget doesn't always allow you to do that.
Yeah.
So typically what I do is I create an internal budget by activity, and then I assign the donor category to those activities based on what they want. And so I end up with basically two budgets.
Okay.
But the internal budget really helps us to implement and plan and also track how much money we're spending on each of those categories that are interest to us.
I'd imagine that internal budget also is easier for any type of grant or any type of like financial application moving forward. So you've really kind of created this nice standardized way of doing things. So are you planning on doing another budget tour in the near post-COVID future? Do you think that we can expect some more of those? Are there any islands in particular that might have been requesting it, or is it to be determined?
Emma did mention that I'm trying to remember whether it was up in St. Lucia.
Okay.
That the National Trust wanted to find out more, needed some help with it. And so there may be a possibility, because this is something that you have to be consistent with.
Right.
We do a training, but everything is not clear cut. There are cases where you might have some questions. People might be wondering, well, how do I approach this? And then being there to give that advice and also help people along with. And I'm glad that when we were there, we actually worked on budgets with people. So it's not like you go in and you do a generic training and people have to figure out from there what they have to do. We actually pull up their budgets, their annual budgets, and we work with those figures and those activities to create something in the end that they can actually use.
Wow, that's actually really helpful.
So that's it's really like applying all of this. So I definitely think there's scope for it. And in Belize, we're also talking about how do we standardize that. There were two other MPs from Belize at the training or the presentation that I did in Turks and Caicos, and they approached me and asked if I could, share how we approach this with their staff as well, and starting to discuss the possibility of using that document even for us at the national level.
Oh, wow.
So
that's big.
There's good potential, and of course we could sit and really tweak this up and agree how it's going to work for all of us. It would be good, as I mentioned to Emma, it would be good to have an idea of what it's costing MPs across the Caribbean to manage their MPs for these categories, and we could really compare and see where the greatest needs are, where the greatest gaps are, and take that to our donors so that they could understand, hey, you can't just be focusing on X, Y, and Z. These are actually the needs on the ground. And for us to be effective, we have to fill those gaps.
Yeah. Definitely. So many gaps.
There's a lot to be done, but I think that, and this is just one aspect of everything. There's the whole science aspect of it that I'm going to leave it to the other experts to deal with.
Yes, you're now officially on the finance side. You've moved from the marine biologist and the sciencey stuff. So we understand. Everyone has their niche.
We have to figure out a name for this. We can't call it finance because it's a bit misleading.
That's true. I know you said development. That development is a bit better of a term.
It can, it can work under development.
Definitely. So if you had to give your top tips or advice to NGOs who are interested in things like budgeting, your kind of final thoughts for any viewers who are watching, what would that, if it's just one thing, what would that be?
It's difficult. I'm an advocate for planning. I believe that if you don't have a good plan, there's so many ways you could go around with implementation, but also in monitoring and evaluation in the end. And so with this type of approach, you take all of that into consideration, and don't approach it in a piecemeal fashion. You have to be able to tie your activities and your targets and your indicators. Sorry. You have to be able to tie those back into your budgets. And so there's, you can only do that from a planning perspective. And so my advice would be to approach it like that. Look at it in an integrated way.
Plan early, plan often.
Yeah. And of course, you have to review every quarter. You basically review your plans because things change. You might be planning to, or you might be expecting to get, if you're relying on grants, you might be expecting to get a grant, or if you're relying on income from entrance fees, you might be expecting to get a certain amount. But 3-4 months down the road, things change.
Like COVID.
There you go. Yep.
Precisely. So it's the reality, That's why I always, when I first started working in conservation, I had been unfamiliar with the term of a living document, which I feel like is a universal term. But when someone first told me, a management plan is a living document, I was like, what does that mean? But just like a management plan, a budget, you also have to keep an eye on these sorts of things because things can change so quickly. So you have to be adaptable, constantly adaptable. So plan early, plan often. Review, revise, and be adaptable when it comes to budgeting. So the last question, which is a fun one that we've been doing with all of our guests. I even had a guest ask me, is this a real question? Are you actually going to ask me this on the show? Yes. Who do you think would win between a seabird of your choice and an octopus? And which seabird are you putting against the hypothetical tussle? Of course, we won't do this in real life. We're not putting together a seabird and octopus.
I would say the octopus going up against a cormorant.
Okay. And why?
Um,
Why is the
because
cormorant not skilled enough?
yeah, because it has to come up for air at some point.
Mm.
Yeah, an octopus can be very strong, and it's a bird going into marine environment.
Well, what
which
if it
is
pulls the octopus out, though?
highly unlikely, though. That's highly unlikely.
That's true, you know. But hypothetically,
Okay.
because this is all a hypothetical, like just imagine,
Yes.
I don't know, maybe the octopus was close to shore and the bird was able to kind of snatch it up onto the beach or onto the rocks.
Okay, well, if it's a small one, yes. But I wasn't thinking of a small one. I was thinking about big enough.
Well, we can say they're equally sized. The bird and the octopus are of the same size, and somehow they end up. Let's say we take them out of the water environment, because an octopus can survive fairly long out of water, and they're like on the rocky shore. Like, how then do you think that this battle would go?
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that if the octopus is in the terrestrial environment or in a bird's home, then it would probably lose.
Yeah.
Okay. But see, if the bird is going into the marine environment, then that's like the territory of the octopus, which I think it has more advantage there.
I think you have a good argument.
So I'm complicating things.
No, totally rational argument, because those are things to consider. I know a couple of people have said, well, if the bird dives in and is able to fling the octopus out, then maybe that's why it's so interesting to access, because then you kind of see how people think about these things, and it's funny too, right?
Yeah.
But definitely. So thank you so much, Joe, for taking the time out of your schedule to be on this episode of MPA Connections. To our viewers, thank you so much for watching. You can definitely follow all the work of the MPA Connect Network on their Facebook page, which is mpaconnect.caribbean, or on their Instagram, which is mpaconnect_Caribbean. And you can also go to those pages to stay in touch and follow this podcast. So thanks so much again, Joe, and thank you everyone for watching.